Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name is Toby, and today I'm delighted that my guest is Professor Cathrine Holst. Cathrine is a professor at the University of Oslo, part of the Department of Sociology and Human Geography there, and also the Arena Centre for European Studies. One of her main areas of research is the role of expertise in policy and in politics, and she's one of the leaders of the EU-funded project Perisha, or Peritia, which is investigating when and why people trust experts. Her strand of that project is entitled Trust and Advice Mechanisms. So, Cathrine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Toby.
So this project on trust and expertise sounds very interesting. I have to admit I'm struggling a bit with pronouncing its name. Peritia or Perisha?
I think that's excellent. I've heard a lot of different pronunciations. I think this one is what works best.
Okay, well, let's go with Peritia then. Is it supposed to be an acronym? Does the letters stand for something?
Yeah, it is. It's policy, trust and expertise in action. So this is the full name of it.
But, okay. All right, so some of the letters in the word aren't actually
No,
used.
no, it's complicated.
I will put the link in the show notes so people who are interested can see the spelling and find out more about the project.
Yeah.
So there has been quite a lot of talk lately in the public discourse about trust or mistrust in experts. I guess this is why the Peritia project exists. Do you have a kind of top-level diagnosis about why we're talking more and more about trust taking a beating recently?
I think, the simple answer that comes to mind would be like populism, that there is currently a bunch of voters, segments of voters that express that they do not really trust experts, that they decreasingly trust experts, and there are politicians around that really want to be their spokespersons and even want to sort of make these views even stronger, and who really politicize this position and try to gain political power on this view that we shouldn't trust the expert. We saw this during the Brexit campaign famously, of course, and we see now in the US elections, and we see this in many countries. And then, so this is a simple answer, and then maybe there are also legitimate reasons for not always trusting experts, and maybe there are some examples of experts not behaving that good or being such good experts after all. So there are maybe also more legitimate issues involved than populism, but I mean, this would be my first answer maybe.
Right, I understand. And which is cause and which is effect, do you think? Does mistrust in expertise kind of come along with populism, or the other way around? Or is there something deeper going on which gives rise to both?
This is a difficult question. I think certainly that populism has sort of increased this trust, and sort of uses this trust that is around already maybe, and to make political gains. So there is, I think there are both. I think there are more fundamental issues involved here that is not directly connected to populism, but I think populism has certainly made this into a larger phenomenon, and this is why we talk about it so much, and why there is so much talk about this now, that there is distrust in experts.
So, I'm sure that this podcast is called Science for Policy, which means, well, on the one hand, I'm confident our listeners will be very interested in your research and in the issues that you work on.
Yeah, maybe.
But also, you're not necessarily preaching to the choir here. I know there are a lot of people listening to this who have an interest or even like a professional agenda to strengthen the role of experts in policymaking. But I take it that you maybe have some reservations about that endeavour, or at least you think it's not as easy as that. So could you kind of lay out your position here? What's the content of the distrust that you see? And when people have concerns about expertise, what do you think they're actually worried about?
Yeah. Well, I should emphasize first that I'm really in favor of expert knowledge informing policy making. I'm all in favor of science advice mechanisms and so on. But, this being said, I think there are legitimate concerns in addition to this thing about populism. And maybe you can roughly categorize the worries that one might have into two. For one thing, there is worries about, experts and even scientific experts that they don't perform that well, that they are biased, that they do mistakes, they are maybe not so good at predicting as they think they are, they do cognitive mistakes, they are overconfident, and they can be politically biased, they can be biased by their disciplinary toolbox, and so on. So there are this concern that maybe experts are not that performing that well after all. And then there's a second kind of concerns related to democracy. Really, shouldn't there be a rule of the people? Haven't experts got too much political power? So these two basic concerns is really something that I think can be legitimately raised.
All right, so let's talk about the democracy part first, which I suppose is a more theoretical issue. And then it'll be interesting to come back to the question of whether, apart from that, experts are actually useful anyway. So what's the tension that you see, or the potential tension perhaps, between democratic decision-making and involving experts?
Well, I see. I think fundamentally, I think there is a tension. On the one hand, you have the democratic norm of, political equality, equal participation, equal political power on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have this idea that some people know more than others about what are good policies. These are the experts, and we give them extra political power because they are particularly knowledgeable. And of course, there can be good reasons for us to do that, but there is initially attention here, I think, even though maybe there could be very good solutions to how we can have it both ways. I mean, at least to a certain extent. But I think originally there is a tension between rule of the people versus rule of the knowledgeable. So this is a starting point.
Okay, great. There's a lot there. So I want to pull one thread out of all that to start with, and that's this idea of the expert knowing more than anyone else. So in what I've read, you've used the term epistemic asymmetry to describe that as a kind of ineliminable problem. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, and maybe, I mean, the epistemic asymmetry term is very much related to a definition of an expert. So a definition of expert would be like someone who knows a lot of things and a lot of more than most people does in one domain. Due to this, there is a huge informational gap, or whatever you can call it, between the expert and the non-expert, called, in the more technical language, and for epistemic asymmetry. And this is something that, it's very hard to do something about, because this is a definition of an expert, that it knows more than non-expert. You cannot get rid of this asymmetry or cognitive inequality, or whatever you can call it. How then should non-experts relate to this? They cannot even understand, the basics of what the expert is explaining, and then how could they assess the decisions? So this is why the term epistemic asymmetry is very central to, if you want to outline the challenges here.
Well, I mean, all right, but the point of having an expert surely is that they know things you don't. So, I mean, why is that a problem? I mean, the expert needs to be able to explain what they know, sure. Or I guess if that's not possible because the asymmetry is so pronounced, at least they need to be able to explain the relevant implications for the policy in question or whatever. And I understand that's not always easy, but isn't the epistemic asymmetry really the whole point of having the expert in the first place?
Maybe this is not always such a practical problem, but maybe we should talk more about it than we do, because maybe it's often simplified how easy it is for people and non-experts to we should check on the experts, we should, control what they are saying, and we should get, it should be transparency and so on, so we can control them and check them. But due to this epistemic asymmetry, can be quite hard, actually.
Okay, I see your point. So it's not easy to satisfy yourself that you're getting good advice if you really can't engage with it in a way that lets you assess it.
Yeah, and and of course you can rely on many proxies, and we do that all the time. You can check the web page of this expert. Does he has an education from a good university? Has he a lot of scientific publications that look relevant? Is he a good performer argumentatively? Maybe he's a good communicator. Do you see other experts supporting him, saying that, yeah, this is an expert, he is a really distinguished professor in this area? So you have a lot of proxies. that could be very useful. We need these proxies, and we should systematize maybe our use of them. But still, in the end, then you cannot really check this for yourself, because the reputation and the merits of the experts depends on other experts' assessments, and you yourself cannot really directly assess it, and so on.
And I guess there are some fields where the proxies might not exist or aren't very strong. So like an emerging field like AI.
Yeah.
If you're trying to make decisions about some complex issue in a brand new area of science, there's a lot of disagreement or uncertainty among the experts anyway, it could be hard to kind of get a grip on who you're talking to.
Yeah, it could be. But maybe the old proxies wouldn't work that well. It's hard to know. What are the interesting journals here? What are the excellent research environment? Are there maybe some new research environments who really are on top of this? But how could you know this? Also, maybe there can be a lot of conflicts between experts. A lot of conflicting expert assessment of who knows more. Who are the most knowledgeable about this? So in these emerging fields with where a lot of new things are happening, controversies and so on, it can be even harder to assess. Even for experts, it can be hard to make assessments.
All right. So on the one hand, we have this kind of asymmetry in knowledge, which makes it hard for non-experts to have a democratic oversight, meaningful oversight of experts. And then on the other hand, you've also talked about the scientization of public debate, which I think is maybe in a way the kind of inverse problem, where policy making can be skewed too far towards scientific considerations and solutions and away from other democratic concerns. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think this goes back once more to the democratic worry, basically, that if we are Democrats, we think that decisions and policies should reflect people's interests, what people value, what goals people have. The people's will should be at the bottom of all this. And of course, then you can have experts informing you, what are the most efficient means to get to your goals. And there are a lot of clarifications that experts can contribute to, but it is a problem if the wider public debate sort of do not capture the relevant concerns and the different life experiences and the different interests of different groups. This could be a problem. Of course, it's not only experts who can sort of pervert public deliberations. You could have strong economic interests, or you could have majorities of different kind that pervert public deliberations, that marginalize some interests and so on. So it's not only about experts, but experts is one of the factors that can be a problem here.
Yeah, I wonder how you see your role here. Because you've said, and I accept, of course, that you are a supporter of scientific expertise being used in policymaking and so on. But on the other hand, you've elaborated quite persuasively on some reasons why people might feel uncomfortable about that. And I wonder whether you're being more the social scientist, so like reporting on people's opinions, even if they don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny, which obviously is important because we need to know about these issues and how people think about them when we design science advice systems or whatever. Or is this something that you think is a legitimate issue and you, more as the philosopher, are identifying these problematic areas which you would want to address, even if society as a whole hadn't noticed them? I guess I'm trying to ask in as polite a way as possible, do you buy what you're selling?
Yeah, maybe it's like, I think it's, for me, in the end, it's more of the latter, that I think sort of irrespective of what people think, I think we want good policy, and I think we want democratic policy, so we should make sure to design our science advice and our expert bodies in ways that sort of take it into account. But then in addition, there is this, of course, concern about what people think about it, and to make institutions that people trust. So maybe you're right. It's little bit of both, but I think the first one is where I start out, sort of.
All right then, and a follow-up question. Science advice is a very broad concept, and expertise is even broader. So do you see these problems as arising across the board whenever experts are involved in policy making? Or do you think it's limited to a few more contentious areas of expertise like economics or something?
There are certainly not hard to find issues or examples of this from the social sciences and economics. I've been studied, among other things, the role of economists in the 2008 financial crisis and the euro crisis and so on. And this has been their role has been very controversial, and it sort of exemplified this criticism against experts. Why didn't economists predict the crisis? Why didn't they come up with better measures when the crisis was here? Why wasn't the people more involved in sort of making the solutions to this when the policies recommended had so huge effects on people's welfare? So I understand why you're asking this, but I think more fundamentally, I think this thing about expert making mistakes and performing better or worse, and that we should care about how we design expert bodies, is not only about economists and social sciences. I think it's more broadly. I mean, you can think now also under the current pandemic and so on, where you see a lot of experts from many different disciplines involved, and still I think you would have these concerns. Are the experts behaving good? What is the role of democracy in the process and decisions now that are taken, and so on?
Okay. So I think that all makes sense to me. I mean, of course, democratic accountability in decision making is a good thing. That doesn't seem too controversial. And we can also grant that scientific evidence is not democratic by its nature. Fine. So I agree there's a tension. But perhaps you can tell me, why isn't the solution to that tension kind of straightforward? I mean, don't you just take some care to build your science advice system? And I suppose there are many examples of this. You build it so that the experts can only give advice as requested by policymakers, and then the actual decisions are made by the politicians. So the politicians can choose to take or leave the science advice, just as they can take or leave any input. And as long as they have the final say on policies, and they're accountable democratically to the electorate for those policies, doesn't that kind of complete the democratic loop? Doesn't that solve the problem?
Yeah, I think there is something to that, certainly. I mean, so we shouldn't exaggerate the tension. So there is something to that. But on the other hand, it is actually a lot of cases where we do delegate decisions to experts. Again, I will study the economic policy and consider the economists of the central bank really deciding interest rate policies, having huge effect on people's lives. We see it also now under the pandemic. We have many countries have delegated a lot of power to experts on what kind of specific measures that are going to be taken. And on the other hand, I think even if there is science advice committee mechanisms that do not take the final decision, they leave that to the parliament and the government, still they have a lot of power when they analyze the problem, tease out the different decision alternatives, and define what is at stake. There is still this tension, I think, with the idea of equality, not only of decision making, but equality of political power. So this does not mean, again, I have to emphasize that this does not mean that I'm against scientific advisory committees. I'm very much in favor of it, but still I think we should be sort of clear about that we, in some senses, give experts an extra vote, not literally, but we do give them also extra political power in defining the problems and sort of telling the politicians what are the relevant decisions to make.
Thinking about the first of those two areas, that seems maybe the clearer one to start with, the idea of politicians delegating decisions to experts, and essentially, as you're describing it, disowning responsibility in that way. To take a concrete example, because you mentioned setting interest rates, well, I remember when the UK government decided for the first time to do exactly that, to delegate setting interest rates to a central bank, to the Bank of England. And that was heralded as an improvement, specifically because it removed a decision from the political arena and gave it to independent experts. So are you saying that's maybe not a net gain?
I think a lot can be gained on that. I think there can be many cases where you can make a good case for also delegating decisions if the politicians are aware of what they are delegating and why they are doing it. For example, in terms of long-term interests for the people, I think this is defensible. Then so this is always kind of the basic justification you have for delegating some decisions to expert, is that it sort of improves on decisions, improves on policies. But you should of course make sure that the expert bodies are organized in ways that makes it likely that they do make good decisions, that the interest rate policy actually is improved by this. And also there is always the democratic concern that you sort of need to balance out. So there's maybe questions here of how much and on which issues you can do that. But I'm certainly not, against delegating decisions if this is, properly thought through, as maybe in the case of central banks.
Okay, that's logical. And then the second example you gave was the issue of involving experts closely in the policymaking process so that they have more influence than the average citizen. So I suppose there are various ways to come at this. One fairly common theme I've heard from people who think about how science advice works and how advice mechanisms should be set up is a theme actually that's been rehearsed several times from different guests on this podcast, about the need for closer and closer interaction between policymakers and experts. So an increasing entanglement, I think one guest described it as. And this is supposed to be a good thing, arguably, because if we don't have that entanglement, then we have failures of communication, we have the inability of research to engage with political needs, and so on. So it's literally about bringing scientists into policymaking infrastructure so they can work side by side with politicians. And I think the reason that hasn't historically been the case, maybe you have a view on this, is that people have wanted to make sure the divide is really clear between the advisors who are independent and don't make decisions and the politicians who are accountable and do. So it seems like you want to have our cake and eat it, and the pendulum swings back and forth. Where do you stand on that dichotomy?
Yeah, I think the reason that one historically, and maybe also there are still some good reasons to, to be, have also a critical approach to being to the too close entanglement idea, is that we want experts to have their independent opinion. So we want experts sort of to make, go through the research and make their scientific assessment of what is state of affairs, what policies work, and so on. And so if we make kind of the interactions with the bureaucrats and the policymakers and the politicians too close, or be that they are entangled in the wrong way, we sort of do not get what we want from experts that are sort of independent advice. On the other hand, there is the question of impact here. Why would we want science advice mechanisms that are so detached from policymakers that they do not have any practical effect at all? And in addition, I also think there is a case to be made for the competence of the policymakers and those setting this into practical life and to practical policies. I mean, scientists can bring much very important knowledge, and what do we know from research or what works and not. But actually, to formulate good policies, one often needs different kind of competences. Regulatory competence, you need a stakeholder knowledge, local knowledge of policymakers, and so on. So this is why there is also, of course, a very strong case for interaction.
Okay, so all very good points, but it seems to me that the fact remains that we really need experts if we want to make any kind of good policy at all, because the world's a complex place and it's getting more complex, and science also is getting more and more specialized. And we can hardly expect all politicians, let alone all voters, to be so well versed in every possible issue that they never need to ask advice from experts. I mean, it's hard enough to expect them even to be well versed enough that they can take experts' reports, understand them, make clear judgments, and then go forward. I mean, so I can see absolutely how this might have negative effects like the ones you've been talking about. Perhaps we end up weakening the grip of democracy on decisions. But isn't that just inevitable? I mean, it's a shame and we should know about it, but isn't it just too bad? We have to make the right decisions about the issues that confront us in the real world. And if that means the balance tips a bit further away from democracy and I suppose towards technocracy, or at least some strong involvement of technocrats, if that's more than we might like, in a way, so be it.
Yeah, I think there are some things to be said for what you are saying. I think you are right in the sense that I think we are expertise reliant. I think we need different kind of expert knowledge to make good and rational policies in the interest of the peoples. And I think we should sort of also utilize scientific developments and the different scientific disciplines in making better societies, in making better policies. So I'm totally against this idea that you could sort of solve this problem or solve this tension by just debunking expertise and don't rely on it. But at the same time, I don't think you at the same time should just be know about what the pitfalls are, and then I think it's a better answer to than should we have experts or should we not have experts is rather that we should think more about how do we organize expert bodies, what are good organizations of science advice, so that we get sort of the best possible institutions, best possible expert advice, those that give us the expert input that we need and that we want for better policies, while at the same time, remaining some democratic mechanisms of control, which is of course difficult because, as you said, it's very hard for non-experts to control experts. When experts explain something and say this is how it is, I know this with my PhD, I've done research in that, it's very hard for non-experts sort of to control them. Or are you right in this? How? Because you don't have, of course, the expertise yourself to control this.
Okay, we've talked about the problems and risks, but I think we also agree that we do need experts nonetheless. So what are the solutions? What can we do when we design science advice systems to try to alleviate some of these difficulties?
I think despite this thing about that is important that there are a lot of interactions between experts and policymakers, I do think it's important with a certain kind of independence for our science advisory mechanisms. Do think it is a very strong case that can be made for experts operating in groups. I mean, this is also a very good thing with the committee system. A lot of research showing that experts that reflect on their own, they are much more biased and do much more mistakes than experts thinking in groups. There are a strong case to be made for multidisciplinary groups in research. And, this is maybe sounds trivial, but in a lot of policy areas, the expert groups or science advice mechanisms are not very multidisciplinary. Again, I've been studying economic policy, and it's really maybe one of the heaviest or most influential policy areas is simply run by economists in very many political systems.
Okay, so this is really interesting. You often hear multidisciplinarity being praised in science advice, but usually for the reason, or at least I thought it was for the reason, that you want to make sure that all perspectives are included and you don't get a kind of myopic view of the evidence.
Yeah.
But you're pointing out that it can also help to reduce human error?
Yeah, I think this is one of the insights from, research from cognitive psychology, sociology, and so on expert performance. How can we ensure that experts make fewer mistakes, that their biases and so on are traced. One of the few things we can do besides having experts that have a nice track record and so on is actually to make sure that there is a relative cognitive pluralism around. And this goes very much into this idea of multidisciplinarity. I think, for experts to perform well, this is maybe more important really than democratic accountability, in the sense that non-experts can criticize experts. That's very important for democratic reasons. But sort of to check whether experts really behave like experts are supposed to, not doing these mistakes. I think this multidisciplinarity, I think it's, even though you often hear about it, we actually need to talk even more about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's not just about bringing in new information, it's also about reducing bias. So what's the thinking behind it? Is it that you get a room full of people with diverse backgrounds? If they're used to thinking about things in different ways, then they can cover each other's blind spots, so to speak.
Yeah, this is fully. I think many of us have this experience from everyday life. I think also, all academics have this experience, and I think also policymakers have it. And it's really to institutionalize and make this even more systematic, to have like the adequate kind of pluralism among competent people. So, democratic accountability, but also to have pluralism among competent people who have sort of different assumptions, different toolboxes, different approaches, and who sort of can then see biases and others' mistakes more easily. And so in this way we can check upon one another. I think this is really one of the robust findings from research on expertise. And I don't think it's controversial, but still it's not really implemented as systematically that one might have thought.
Do you think it's possible to invent a perfect science advice mechanism? So one where you eliminate as many of these issues as possible and make maximum allowances for the rest? Or is it always going to be about striking a balance and making trade-offs?
I'm not into this language of making something perfect or making this kind of blueprint proposals. I think there can be different ways to do this more concretely, where you sort of try to increase on experts' performance, try to go along with democratic accountability. But in my idea of this, there will always be trade-offs, better and worse. Maybe sometimes you cannot say that this is a perfect one, but maybe you can see that no, this performs less bad. We have more reasons to be ensured about this one, that this performs better. So it's more in those terms. I think we should talk about this. I don't think we can make it perfect. And even though also, of course, if you have perfect procedures in place, there is multidisciplinarity, there is democratic accountability and all the things you want, still, of course, the advice in the end could be bad. There could be some people could take wrong. It could be wrong. There could be uncertainties. Conditions could change, and there could always there is no guarantee in the end that the advice would be actually of the quality that the procedures promise.
Thank you for that. I think that's a superb summary and a note of realism to finish with, which in a way is a shame because I actually have one more question I wanted to ask you. So a few weeks ago, I interviewed Kerry Funk, who does research for Pew Research Center in the US, and she has access to a lot of data about, among other things, trust in scientists. So the most recent Pew research concluded that, I've got the quote here, scientists as a group are highly regarded compared with other prominent groups and institutions in society. So the figure is much higher than trust in other groups such as the private sector or governments or journalists, for instance. So do you think this means we have less to worry about than your kind of starting statement might suggest? That people actually do have a fair amount of trust in science and scientists?
I think one should be, appreciate these results, and one should not, make this problem of distrust in scientists and experts bigger than it actually is. So there is also in this age of populism this idea that this problem of distrust in scientists and experts is exaggerated. So this evidence is very valuable. So at the same time, I looked at the background of this, and there is certainly this varies a lot, I think, but both between countries and concerning what kind of issues are involved, and in some controversies there is maybe a case for not so high trust in experts. And maybe there's also this thing about when people are asked general question about do you trust scientists, and then you have maybe the just as interesting questions about do you trust this expert body and how this expert body behaved in this or that controversy, then maybe you would get a different answer. But anyway, I think this was very interesting findings. And then on the other hand, as I said, my main interest in this is not really dependent on this, what do people think, although this is of course always interesting. It's also that I think we have a deeper concerns to make institutions that work well and that we will want to live under.
Great. So, Cathrine Holst, thank you very much indeed for this conversation and for giving us so much food for thought, especially for those of us who work on science advice design and infrastructure. Good luck with the prioritise project, and thank you.
Yeah, you will see. I hope it's worked out somehow.
The Science for Policy podcast is produced by SAPEA. We're a consortium of Europe's academies and learning societies, and we're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism. We provide evidence and expertise to inform the work of the group of chief scientific advisors. SAPEA is funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 programme for research and innovation, and you can find lots more information about us and our work at sapea.info. Finally, the rather lovely cello music that's playing right now is performed by Elizaveta Slushchenko. So I shall shut up and let you enjoy the last few bars. Bye for now.